Mr. President, we are most grateful that you have made time to come and highlight the importance of infrastructure to Africa's future. I want to start by pointing out that you were recently recognized as African of the Year by Forbes Africa magazine. Yes, that is worth celebrating. And part of this was the recognition of the incredible work you have done in repositioning Ghana on the global stage and saying, this is who we are as an African country with agency making its own decisions. Just talk us through some of your thinking behind why you do the things you do when you represent Ghana on the global stage.
First of all, I want to thank you and also the leadership of the AFC for inviting me here. We have a very intimate association with the AFC. A founder member, a shareholder, and the AFC has done a lot of very significant work in Ghana, especially in our energy sector, and continues to be very engaged. So when I got the invitation, I said, apart from other reasons, I have to appear. And I have good other reasons why I'm here. I have Nigerian children. I have children.
Well, that's a good reason.
Who come from Ife here in Nigeria. So that's another important link. And of course, you know, the link between Nigeria and Ghana is historic, long-standing. And it's one that we're very interested in growing and expanding and deepening. So there are all these other reasons why I'm here. So it's important. I think that we don't have a choice. There have been models of development that have been outlined for us since independence from outside this continent. Frankly, when you look at the state of our continent, 50, 60 years after independence, it isn't where we ought to be. The critical issues, the eradication of mass poverty, the development of our economies, the industrial transformation of the continent, all of these have not happened. And they haven't happened because we've been following models that are more responsive to other people's aspirations and expectations and desires than our own. So I came into office with the support of the Ghanaian people for us to be able to articulate a new way of going forward, which was, first of all, identifying what are the critical issues that we need to master if we're going to go forward. Clearly, education is critical. And that's why we came forward with this program for opening up access to education in Ghana, the free senior high school policy, which has now made secondary education in Ghana free in the public system of Ghana. It has brought about a significant expansion of access of young people to secondary education. And in that, we're increasingly putting emphasis on technical education, on STEM education as a way to the future. Secondly, we also have to have a more radical view of what we need to do about our industrial transformation. We cannot continue to be exporters of raw materials and expect to develop wealth in our economies. It's not going to happen. We have to be more concerned about the value-added components of economic development. I was very excited to hear the president of the AFC in his introductory remarks talking about the issue of cocoa, for instance, where a $130 billion industry, the producers in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire between them, are responsible for 2/3 of the world's output of cocoa. We receive less than 10%, 6 to 7% in the value chain of cocoa. Those are statistics that cannot possibly continue. And that therefore there is a need for us to relook at our own strategy, our own policies, as far as cocoa development is concerned. In that area, it led us to an understanding with Côte d'Ivoire, which we call the Cocoa Initiative between our two countries, as part of a strategic relationship between our two countries, which is insisting on certain minimum interventions in the cocoa industry, both on the part of the consumers as well as the producers, to uplift the incomes of our farmers and expand our capacity to grow. And more importantly, focusing the attention on domestic production of chocolate. So the significant efforts are being made in Ghana, not just now to produce the raw bean, but actually do something about its transformation in Ghana. So you have these critical areas of development, of growth, where we need to refocus how we intend to go about it. We're talking about our infrastructure. We're talking about an area where we may not have all the money that we require. You've heard Vice President Osibanjo talking about the huge infrastructural needs of Nigeria. In relative terms, it's the same as for the rest of the continent. I mean, the figures may change. For Ghana, it's a much smaller country than Nigeria. But in relative terms, the figures are very constant. And at the same time, you look at our domestic resources. It is a fact that the tax to GDP ratios, for instance, on the average in Africa, are much lower than they are for Europe, the Caribbean, Latin America, Asia, and for instance, in the OECD countries. They say that the average tax to GDP ratio of African countries is around about 16%. Whereas in the OECD countries it's 33%. So immediately you can see where a gap has arisen, which needs to be addressed, how to improve our own domestic resource mobilization. But the elephant in the room is that those who are holding the wealth of the world are not in Africa. Global assets in the hands of private sector operators are X number of times much greater than the assets that are available to African countries. So our access to private capital, to private sector financing, is a critical aspect of our capacity to develop on the continent. And there we have a big problem.
I would really like you to develop that point in terms of who are the institutions, what are the institutions that are making the case for Africa in those rooms where those who hold global capital are making decisions on where to spend it. We have an institution like the AFC, which has, of course, managed to pump into 35 countries billions of dollars over the years that it's been in operation. But what do you see as the scope for replicating institutions like the AFC across Africa that can speak at a global level for us?
Well, it's absolutely important that we should expand the influence of institutions like AFC, like the ADB. ADB has recently gone for a recapitalization to enable it to be able to do more. The AFC is in the same, and we need the governments of the continent, we need to put our weight behind this attempt to focus. But we also equally need also to address structural constraints in the private capital, in the global capital markets of the world. And the most significant is this so-called African risk premium. You have a situation where we go to the market for money and we pay much more than our equivalents elsewhere. You want to ask yourself the question, why? It is because we are perceived as being riskier for the investors. Risk. How is that defined? Argentina, and this is without prejudice to, but Argentina in recent times has defaulted 9 separate occasions on its debt. Yet, 5-6 years ago, I believe it was in 2017, when Argentina went to the market to raise a 100-year bond, it ended up paying a coupon rate of, I believe it's 6.5% to 7%. Angola, which has not defaulted since the end of the Civil War on any of its debt obligations, went to the market at the same time and tried to raise a bond and was asked to pay 2 percentage points more than Argentina. So you ask yourself, what is it? What's going on? And these are the matters that the leaders on the continent, we need to find a solution for and address. And I think a discussion with the credit agencies that are responsible for, they're like the gatekeepers of the international capital market. And they are the ones who set the rules. That there's a need for us to engage with them very much more so that we can get a more even playing field, because that in itself would unlock significant amounts of capital that are available for our development. But it is a matter of urgency that all of us need to pay attention to so we can do something about it. It cannot continue to be the case. You don't default on your debts, and yet you're considered a risk. How does that work? Risk is attached to people who time and again find it impossible or are unwilling to pay. We pay when we borrow. And so yet we're still being stigmatized as risky places to put your money. There's something which is not right about that equation, and we need to do something about it.
You raise such a crucial point, and we have seen this with the pandemic. This is another thing your administration has pointed out, with ratings agencies, for instance. Over the course of the pandemic, 56% of African countries downgraded. That number in Europe, under 10%, 9.2, I think. In Asia, just about 28%. And yet, Africa showed great resilience. I think the contraction was just under 2%, which, if you look at the global figures, was 3.3%. So a clear asymmetry there. But the question everybody has is, but what can be done? What needs to be done by African governments to change that?
I think the statement that was made by Vice President Osinbajo is one that we all ought to take very seriously. The need for us to sit around the table and agree on the way forward in these areas.
And when by us, you mean
I mean
African
the
governments?
African governments and its leaders. We have the opportunities with our continental and regional organizations to get together to talk. I think there should be a more pointed effort on our parts, both at the continental and the regional level, to come to grips with some of these issues. We have pressing political and security challenges that usually dominate our meetings. It's unfortunate, but that is the reality. But nevertheless, I think that it is important that we begin to focus our energies on establishing a common position on some of these critical economic matters, because at the end of the day, that is the way forward for the development of the continent. So I think that is absolutely critical. Sitting together, agreeing on the way forward, and then, of course, devising the methods that would allow us to go forward. I think that has to be the way forward. And the urges, the drive for that commonality is what should be. And I'm particularly excited by the fact that in our time, in leadership in Africa, we were able to bring the African Continental Free Trade Agreement into operation. That today, the Secretariat has been established, the trading has begun, even on a very limited scale, but it has begun. And we're going to see very soon the results of this common approach to problems bearing fruit. And I hope that it'll be a harbinger of how the continent is going to develop in the next decades and more.
As we wrap up our discussion, I'd like to bring up something you recently said to your people about democracy. You said the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. I'd like to ask, what would you see as the price for economic prosperity in Africa, the price for the eradication of poverty? What are the sacrifices we need to make today in order to ensure that?
That's a large question, and you have sacrifices that have to be made by governments in terms of their control of their expenditures, making sure that the expenditures are directed to what is really necessary. We have also the sacrifices that will be made in setting up institutions that really reflect our aspirations and challenges. We have also to understand that nobody is going to come out from up there or from outside the continent to develop the continent for us, so that the sacrifices that have to be made in terms of paying of taxes, raising of domestic revenues to be able to confront the challenges, all of these are the sacrifices that are required for us to make at this stage. And we have to be prepared to do so, and also to have our leaders articulate that this is the way forward, and nobody is going to come and develop this continent for us other than ourselves. So let us understand that we have to rise up to the challenge and do it for ourselves. Other people have done it, and that is what convinces me that we also can do it, so long as we have the right attitude.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. I think for all of us that has been a true rallying call that will guide us through the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you very much.